Welcome to the Humanists of Greater Portland. I am here at Friendly House this morning. Zoom audience, love you too. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists, like those gathered here today, attempt to live the best life they can envision because this is the only life of which they are certain. Humanism affirms the dignity of all people. Humanists value people not only for all that they have accomplished in the arts, sciences, and humanities, but also simply for their human potential.
We're going to honor one of our great members whose 80th birthday is coming up in a week. Yeah, Val Humble.
Sing along if you know it. Hear that lonesome whippoorwill. He sounds too blue to fly. The midnight train is whining low. I'm so lonesome I could cry. I've never seen a night so long, and time goes crawling by. The moon just went behind the clouds to hide its face and cry. Did you ever see a robin weep when leaves begin to die? Like me, he's lost the will to live. I'm so lonesome I could cry. The silence of a falling star lights up the purple sky. And as I wonder where you are, I'm so lonesome I could cry. Yeah, I could cry. I'm so lonesome I could cry.
Jeff has been a faculty member at Pacific U there and 30 years and teaching political science.
Well, since it's Music Day, I'll sing you a little song about equality, an old song, but I only know one verse. I don't know who originally did this, but the version I grew up with was by Tennessee Ernie Ford. You dig 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. So thinking about inequality, put another way, how much equality do we really want? I want to ask everybody a question here, a couple of questions. First, how many of you think that the United States has too high a level of inequality? I thought that would be pretty unanimous. How many of you would like to live in a society of absolute equality, where everybody received exactly the same remuneration for their work? I thought so. Nobody. Which means that most of us, and I think most people, want a society that's somewhere between the gross inequality that we have and zero inequality. But that's a big gap in there. So how do we go about thinking about where in that gap is a justifiable level of inequality, or on the flip side, a justified level of equality? Few have ever advocated complete equality. Plato advocated complete equality, but only for his ruling class. They were all to have exactly the same level of sustenance. It was not to be luxurious, but it was all to be the same, because he thought that was the only way you could prevent them from being partial to one interest or another. They were to lead a good life, but a relatively simple life. They weren't even to have families, because that might get them to be partial towards their children or towards their spouses. The only major theorist, well, I don't know if I'd call him a major, the only significant theorist I know of who called for absolute total equality was a guy named Babeuf in the French Revolution. And I want to read you a little bit of Babeuf. We are all equal, are we not? This principle remains incontestable, because nobody would seriously claim, unless he were willing to be considered mad, that it is night when it is really day. What is it, you ask, that we need above and beyond equality of rights? We not only need that equality which is set down in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, this was during the French Revolution, we want it right in our midst, under our own roofs. We consent to everything for the sake of this, and will renounce everything else in order to have this alone. Let all the arts perish if necessary, as long as real equality remains to us. Let it come to an end at last, this great scandal that our posterity will never believe. Disappear at last revolting distinctions between rich and poor, great and small, masters and servants, governors and governed. Let there be no differences between human beings other than those of age and sex. Since all have the same needs and the same families, there should be a common education and a common supply of food for all. People of France, what signs do you need in order to recognize an excellent constitution when you see one? The one founded entirely upon de facto equality is the only one that can suit you and satisfy all your desires. People of France, open your eyes and your hearts to the fullness of felicity. Recognize and proclaim along with us the Republic of Equals. The response of the French, as I recall, was to guillotine him, but he was a little too radical for Robespierre, those guys. Not even Marx ever advocated absolute equality. After all, his slogan about the way things were to be distributed in the future communist society was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Not everybody gets the same, because different people have different needs. In a piece called The Critique of the Gotha Program, he said, and of course we won't be able to get to that right away, in the transitional period, the slogan will be, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. According to his productivity, because that's the best we can do. In the meantime, given the culture and given the transitional society, eventually we'll get to where to each according to his need. There are real problems with absolute equality. Should we spend the same amount on medical care for the sick as we do for the healthy? If we give a disabled person a wheelchair, does that mean everybody has to get a wheelchair in order to maintain equality, or everybody has to get the monetary equivalent of the wheelchair in order to maintain equality? Should big people not be allowed to use more fabric for their clothes than small people? A philosopher named Robert Nozick pointed out that let's assume that we have a society of complete equality. And then you make something You make a piece of jewelry, and I give you some money for it. Well, now you have more money than everybody else does. We have just violated principle of equality. If I decide out of the goodness of my heart to give you some resources, to put a roof on your house, well, now I'm less than equal and you're more than equal. The way he puts it is really dedicated socialists committed to absolute equality would have to forbid capitalist acts among consenting adults. Yes, they'd have to be, it'd have to be a crime to transfer resources to anybody, because as soon as you did, then you would have upset the absolute equality principle. But if perfect equality is implausible and undesirable, so is extreme inequality. And there's no question that inequality in the United States has gotten much worse in the last 60 years, and that U.S. inequality is much more extreme than in other countries. And bear with me, I just want to give you a few numbers. I hope that even for the mathematically challenged, I could make these come through clearly. There's a statistic that I like. How much income does the top 10% of a society get compared to the bottom 10%? In the United States, the top 10% have 18.5 times as much income as the bottom 10%. Remember that number, 18.5. How does that compare to other countries? Favorite country of mine, some of you know, is Uruguay, a Latin American country where you would expect there would be more inequality than in the US. But that figure that was 18.5 times in the United States is only 11.8 times in Uruguay. In Spain, it's only 10.3 times. In Sweden, the top 10% only have 6.2 times the income of the bottom 10%. And in Japan, the top 10% have only 4.5 times as much as the bottom 10%, while we have 18.5%. So we are radically more unequal, not than some utopian ideal, but radically more unequal than countries in the world today that are functioning just fine, thank you. It's also become worse over time, using a different measure, the same kind of thing, the top 10% versus the bottom 10%, but with a different methodology. Another study said this number was 9.1 in 1980. In 2018, it was 12.6, from 9.1 to 12.6 in just 38 years. Another interesting measure is, what do CEOs make compared to the average worker? One study looking at the CEO pay for the top 350 companies in the country said in 2022, that ratio was 344 to 1. CEOs made 344 times what the average worker in their companies made. In 1965, instead of 344 to 1, the ratio was 21 to 1. So in the space of 60 years, the gap between CEOs and the workers they supervise has exploded. And that's increased a lot just in the last decade or two. Again, how does that compare to other countries? Well, another methodology with another measure came up with slightly different numbers. They had in the US, CEOs make 265 times what the average worker makes. 265, remember that number. In Canada, it's only 149, which still seems pretty outrageous to me, but it's a lot less outrageous than in the United States. In Spain, 143 to 1. In Germany, 136 to 1. In Japan, it's 50 to 1. And for top firms, it's only 12 to 1 in Japan. Now, some of these things are related to culture. I think Americans tend to be more tolerant of inequality than most other societies. So I think it's unlikely that we would ever get equality down to the level of Japan. But we're way out of sync with other countries. This inequality is reflected in life expectancy. Adults with at least a master's degree have a life expectancy that's 14.7 years higher at age 18 than those with less than a high school degree. 14.7 years. That's a lot. And 8.3 years higher life expectancy than those with a high school education. Individuals living in poverty had 10.5 years lower life expectancy than those with incomes 400% of the poverty threshold. Laborers and those employed in craft and repair occupations had respectively 10.9 years and 8.6 years lower life expectancy at age 18 than those with professional and managerial occupations. Remember those kinds of numbers when you hear someone talking about further increasing the retirement age or the eligibility age for Medicare. This would hit lower income people and working people much harder than upper class people and professional people, because lower class people and working class people don't live nearly as long. They've only going to have a few years after after age 65 compared to others. Women in the most advantaged socioeconomic group, so rich women, outlived men in the most disadvantaged group by 23.5 years. That's incredible how big that is. The life expectancy for blacks, 70.8 years. For whites, 76.4 years. One author pointed out, black men in Harlem were less likely to reach the age of 65 than men in Bangladesh. This inequality has major consequences for the quality of life. I recommend to you a very interesting book called The Spirit Level. The authors are Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And they systematically compared social outcomes across US states and then also comparing the United States to foreign countries. And what they found was very consistent with respect to a whole range of social conditions. Places with more inequality had less social trust. This is both across countries and across states in the United States. Fewer, by social trust, fewer people said that most people can be trusted. So it has an impact on social cohesion. More inequality, more mental health problems, and higher levels of drug addiction, and not just among the poor. More inequality, lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, higher rate of obesity, higher rate of teenage pregnancy, and overall worse health. More inequality, lower levels of educational attainment as measured by international standardized tests. The U.S. consistently scores way below other developed countries on these international standardized tests in mathematics and science and so forth. More inequality, greater social violence, higher crime rates. Especially interesting in this book is that the data they provide show that even the rich in unequal societies suffer from these social effects. One would think that with their greater wealth than the rich in more equal societies, that these super rich would be better off than the rich in more equal societies. Not so. They are much worse off than rich people in more equal societies. The rich in unequal societies have worse life expectancy, higher rates of mental illness, and worse overall health than the rich people in more equal societies. Moreover, they are more frequently victims of violent crime, and their children are more likely to have teenage pregnancies, engage in criminal activity, and suffer from mental illness and drug addiction. The subtitle of the Spirit Level book is Why Equality is Better for Everyone, including the rich. Reducing inequality, in short, would not only benefit poor people, rich people also benefit from more equality. But how much equality do we want? You said you didn't want absolute equality. And we all agreed that extreme inequality is undesirable, but there's a huge middle ground there. How much equality do we really want? Do we want to return to the greater economic equality of the United States in the 50s and 60s? Like that CEO number where CEOs only made 21 times the average worker instead of 344 times. Why that level in particular of the US in the 50s and 60s? Hard for me to say that, oh, we were too equal back then, but some people might say that. Those CEOs making 344 times probably said, yeah, we were way too equal back then. Do we want as much equality as exists in Sweden or more radically in Japan? Why? Or why not? What criteria can we use to decide what level of equality is the one we want? This is not a simple question. A theorist named Jennifer Hochschild, when she was a professor at the University of Washington, wrote a very interesting book about this, whose title escapes me, and I didn't write it down. She discovered we have very different values about equality in different domains of our social life. We are not willing to accept easily any formal inequality in political life. We don't want some people to have more votes than other people. John Stuart Mill suggested a system like that, in which more educated people would have more votes than less educated people. In Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, they had a semi-democratic system. They had an elected parliament and so forth, but it was rigged in such a way that middle and upper class people had more votes than lower class people did. We don't want some people to have more votes than other people. We don't want big groups of people excluded from the vote. We give at least strong lip service to the concept of equality under the law, and no one is above the law, even if the reality is often different than that. So in the political realm, we tend to be highly egalitarian, right? In our values, at least, if not always in our practices. But we tolerate much greater economic inequality in economic life. If we support capitalism in any form, and Sweden and Japan, for all their equality, are highly capitalist societies, we are resigned to the reality that it has to be possible for entrepreneurs to get reasonably rich to create incentives for innovation and risk-taking. In day-to-day social life, we tend to value everyone having the same level of social respect. Our Constitution forbids the creation of an aristocracy. We tolerate social inequality inside families. Parents have authority over children. But when a group of friends goes out to eat together, it would be weird to always defer to some person to choose the restaurant, to the same person to choose the restaurant, choose what each of us will eat, or expect everyone else to subsidize their fair share of the bill. In social interactions, we expected to be treated with equal respect. So we have very different expectations about equality depending on the situation, depending on the context, depending on the issue, and the realm of social relations that we're talking about. That's one complication. But even if we want to accept inequality in some realms, what criterion should we use to justify unequal outcomes for different people? Hochschild describes 6 different principles that we sometimes apply to particular situations to decide how much inequality we want. I'll just go through these quickly. The first is strict equality. Everybody gets the same. One person, one vote. We do apply that in some contexts. Need. All needs of community members deserve equal satisfaction. For example, we might believe healthcare is a human right, and everyone deserves full medical care, even if that means some need much more care than others. So sometimes we think need is the appropriate way to decide who gets more, who gets less. Investments. Community members deserve rewards in proportion to what they put into the community. Students should be graded according to their level of effort rather than the level of achievement. What they invested in the work, not what they accomplished in the work. And I think most teachers actually do apply that criterion, slightly at least. Not fully, but they take it into consideration. Results. Community members deserve rewards in proportion to their productivity or social contribution or level of achievement. Capitalist markets claim that they work on that principle. Ascription. That is, community members deserve rewards according to relevant ascriptive traits, such as age, sex, race, class, or religion. Christians get these benefits, atheists don't. It's ascriptive, right? Atheists don't get to be governor of the state of Texas because the Constitution forbids it. Yes. And nobody in the legislature wants to stand up and say, we have to change this because I think atheists ought to be allowed to be governor of Texas. It's not good political rhetoric in the state of Texas. We don't tend to support this idea of using ascription, but we use it. Affirmative action for racial minorities have an element of this. Discounts for seniors or eligibility for Medicare by age fall into this category. If I'm 65, I'm eligible for Medicare, and if I'm 64, I'm not. Doesn't matter whether I'm a good person, a bad person, whether I've contributed a lot to society or not. My age alone qualifies me for a benefit that other people are excluded from. And sixth, procedures. Community members deserve rewards according to the results of specified processes, no matter what those results are, such as free consent, random rules, the market, or democracy. A lottery works like this. We all go buy lottery tickets, and most of us lose the money we spent on the lottery, and somebody gets $1 billion. And we say, well, that's fair. Everybody had the same chance to win, but the outcomes are radically unequal. The winners get a lot, and the losers get nothing. And by and large, we think that's fair. Or a raffle. You know, you all put together some money and you say, you know, if you buy a raffle ticket, we're going to draw one of the numbers out of a hat and you win an electric bicycle. Well, the one who wins the electric bicycle gets more than the people who bought raffle tickets and got nothing, but we think that's fair because everybody had the same chance. So we accept the results sometimes of procedures that we think are fair, even if the outcomes are radically unequal. And as Hochschild goes through all these, the reader tends to find that, well, yes, I support each of these for different situations. In that case, one criterion can't be used for all of our efforts to settle on a particular level of inequality. Because inequality has so many different dimensions, and we have different ideas about what principles you should apply depending on what the situation is. Another approach is by a philosopher named John Rawls. How many of you here have ever heard of John Rawls? Yeah, he's become more wide known than most philosophers do. A professor at Harvard who did most of his big work in the 60s and 70s. He has a single principle for regulating economic inequality. He calls it his difference principle. And the difference principle is, what principle would we agree to with our fellow community members if none of us knew what position we will occupy in the society constructed with the principle? He calls this imaginary deciding on principles the original position. It's like we all get together for a meeting, right? Including what he calls a veil of ignorance, where we don't know whether we will be rich or poor, white or black, male or female, well-educated or poorly educated, until we lift the veil of ignorance. So what principles would you use to structure society if you don't know what your position in that society is going to be? Now, he says our first instinct confronted with this problem is, I want absolute equality. I don't want to lift the veil of ignorance and find out that I'm in poverty and you're living in a mansion. So I think everybody should be equal. But on second thought, what if some forms of inequality would make everyone better off? Shouldn't we permit, for example, doctors to make more? How many doctors do we have in here? Any doctors? Gee, I thought the humanists were thick with doctors. Shouldn't we permit, for example, doctors to make more income as an incentive to get them to submit to the long years of difficult education and high stress of their occupations? If not, would we get any doctors? Shouldn't we permit patents and copyrights in order to stimulate socially desirable innovation and creativity? Shouldn't we allow entrepreneurs to get richer than the rest of us in order to get desirable levels of economic activity if we're resigned to some form of a capitalist society? But for Rawls, there's an important limit to all of these permitted inequalities. He suggests that the only structural inequalities we would be willing to tolerate if we didn't know who we were going to be are those that benefit everyone, and in particular, those that benefit the worst off in the society. Because when we remove our veil of ignorance, we may find that we are in the least well-off group. So only inequalities that benefit the least well-off. This could make for a pretty strict limitation. How much economic incentive does Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk really need in order to lead them to engage in socially useful entrepreneurship? Assuming that that's what they're engaged in. But some entrepreneurs are engaged in socially useful entrepreneurship. Do they really need to have the possibility of being worth hundreds of billions of dollars? Wouldn't $1 billion have been sufficient incentive? For Rawls, there should be no more incentive for entrepreneurs or any other category than absolutely necessary to get the socially beneficial activity. Anything more than that is essentially unnecessarily stealing from the least well-off. Many have seen this as a justification for a democratic capitalist society with a generous welfare state, sort of European social democracy. And moderate left of center politicians in England and the United States in the 1970s and 80s actually had little study groups where they were reading Rawls and thinking about this as a way of thinking about how to do social policy and what inequalities they should tolerate and what inequalities they should try to whack away at. Others have seen it as a possible justification for trickle-down economics, provided that the benefits of allowing big profits actually does trickle down to the benefit of the least advantage in terms of greater employment, higher wages, broadly shared economic growth. But if you can demonstrate that it actually does trickle down, then Rawls' principle might be used to justify tax cuts to entrepreneurs. But it's got to actually trickle down. That's the important point. And most of the evidence indicates that most things done in the name of trickle-down economics don't actually trickle down much. What's nice about Rawls's criterion is that it provides a reasonably specific criterion for assessing whether any principle that would produce inequality is in fact justifiable. And the form of it is actually the way Republicans do justify tax cuts. They're empirically wrong, but their claim is if we cut taxes for the rich, the poor benefit. That's a perfectly legitimate kind of argument. What's illegitimate about it is that the facts show that that doesn't happen, in which case then it's a bad argument. And people on the other side can say, well, the form of your argument is very nice, but the facts show that cutting taxes for the rich does not in fact benefit the poor, but quite the opposite. Yes, yes. What about the political effects of economic inequality? Theorists have been worrying about the effects of great wealth on the world of politics for a long time. That's why Plato wanted his ruling class not to be the rich and not to be able to get richer than their regular standard of living that he was prepared to give them. In the 18th century, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French Enlightenment philosopher, suggested a standard I like for thinking about this problem of money and politics. Here was his criterion of equality. No one should be so rich as to be able to buy another man's vote. And no one should be so poor that they feel the need to sell their vote. I like that. It's got a nice symmetry to it. In a slightly different vein, Rousseau also wrote, never in a monarchy can the opulence of an individual put him above the prince. But in a republic, it can easily put him above the law. Then the government no longer has force, and the rich are always the true sovereign. More recently, in the early 20th century, the great Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, commented, we can have a democratic society, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few. We cannot have both. And in today's America, we are still facing this problem with enormous concentrations of wealth and efforts by some of our wealthiest citizens to distort, even control, our political system. This again, though, is a complicated problem. It's important to understand that in a capitalist society that permits, even encourages, the accumulation of wealth as an incentive for entrepreneurship, it is impossible to completely insulate our democracy from its effects. The political playing field in a capitalist society can never be level. It will always and necessarily be tilted in favor of disproportionate political influence for the capitalist class, because there are so many mechanisms for translating wealth into political power. This reality is not just an intermittent pathological anomaly that can be fixed by a vigorous reforms movement. To quote a familiar saying from the world of computer software, it's a feature, not a bug. At the same time, the forms and levels of political inequality produced by capitalist economic inequality varies dramatically across different capitalist societies and may even vary substantially over time within any particular capitalist country. It is possible for democracies to be completely overwhelmed by the rich and turn into out-and-out plutocracies where only the political interests of the rich are attended to. But it is also possible to significantly contain the political effects of wealth so that political initiatives from non-wealthy interests can often succeed. And get the National Labor Relations Board, Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, all the reforms of the New Deal, which happened in a highly unequal society, Medicare, civil rights laws, etc. The goal of achieving almost complete political equality in a capitalist society is essentially an oxymoron. But the goal of managing economic and political inequality in such a way as to promote political stability and a substantially open democracy that provides genuine opportunities for real economic and political reform is perfectly viable and very important. To think about how to accomplish this sort of containment of the impact of wealth, it's necessary not to think about inequality in a simplistic way. The absolute level of economic inequality may be less important than the form that inequality takes. I read the other day that Taylor Swift was recently declared to be a billionaire. Michael Jordan, I believe, is also a billionaire. Damian Lillard and Giannis Antetokounmpo now have contracts that will pay them, just in salaries, $60 million a year. But do we really have to worry about our politics being distorted by the wealth of entertainers and sports stars? Last I heard, I haven't heard of any major entertainer or sports star. Well, yeah, I wouldn't call him that. Yeah, but he didn't do it with his wealth. It wasn't his wealth. But he didn't do it with his. He didn't do it with his wealth. He didn't pour money into political campaigns to that. But yes, the celebrity value is a problem. On the other hand, in many countries, even in the present, but especially in the past, wealthy landowners with subordinate peasant workforces often completely control the rural votes of poor people. That's a form of wealth that completely distorts democratic processes. When I lived in Brazil, I read a story that a famous Brazilian soccer player who'd grown up as in a poor peasant family in northeast Brazil told about his experiences in elections. And when it came time for elections, the landowner of the area, would gather all his peasant workers together and take them to the polls together. He would give the first person in line a fake ballot. They would go into the polling place, get a genuine ballot, put the fake ballot in the ballot box, and bring the genuine ballot out to the landowner, who would fill it out and give it to the next person in line, who would go in, get another ballot, put the ballot that the landowner had filled out in the thing, and come. And so in this way, he would dictate the votes of all of his peasants, the first one. And the soccer player who was in line waiting to cast his vote, it came his turn, and the landlord gave him the envelope with the ballot, the filled out ballot in it. And so he started to open it and look at it. And the landlord said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He said, "Well, I want to see who I'm voting for." And the landowner replied, "Don't you know that in Brazil we have a secret ballot?" So that kind of wealth is really problematic for democracy, right? Thinking in these terms, although there are some super wealthy individuals like the Koch brothers who have an unhealthy political influence to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars spent in each campaign cycle, it may be that the bigger threat to American democracy comes more from the influence of large corporations, especially multinational corporations. It's also important to think about the mechanisms that exist for translating economic power into political power. Our system of massive campaign expenditures funded by private, often undisclosed wealth is a perfect tool for exaggerating the influence of money in politics. No other country I'm aware of does this, works like that. The Supreme Court's Citizen United and related decisions may have had the effect of making the mechanism of campaign contributions a much more powerful instrument for the insertion of corporate economic interests into our national political life than it was previously. Well, what can be done? Well, lots of things. I just want to suggest a couple of things. Simply reducing overall inequality by higher taxes on the rich, which I would be in favor of, may not have much of an impact on the influence of money in politics, if they still have plenty of money that they want to use that way. It may be more effective to concentrate on attacking the mechanisms that allow the conversion of wealth into politics. That means, for example, reducing the costs of campaigns by providing free media time to candidates and banning the purchase of media time by private money, as most countries do. No other major countries allow serious political discourse to be drowned out by the propaganda of privately funded negative TV advertising. Only us. We might also create a system of exclusively public funding of political campaigns to reduce the dependence of politicians on wealthy donors. We could institute an especially rigorous enforcement agency policing inappropriate gifts to public officials. Are you listening, Clarence Thomas or Robert Menendez? Or much more strictly enforce rules that have stricter rules and enforce them more strictly that prevent personnel from regulated industries from serving in the agencies that regulate them, and prevent regulatory personnel from taking jobs in regulated industries after their public service. Finally, rather than or in addition to trying to limit the influence of the wealthy in politics, it is possible to think about creating countervailing forces by politically empowering the non-wealthy. The most important step in this vein would be to reinvigorate labor unions, which in the 50s and 60s wielded a lot of political power that offsets somewhat the influence of corporate interests. Another mechanism, as a favorite of mine, might be to outlaw private campaign contributions. Probably need a constitutional amendment to do this, but outlaw private campaign contributions, but make it easier for every eligible American to become a registered voter and give every registered voter a $100 voucher each campaign cycle, which could only be used to contribute to campaigns for candidates or ballot measures during campaigns. In other words, not only one person, one vote, not only one person, one vote, but also one person, $1. This would force political actors to cater primarily to the needs of the average voter rather than to wealthy donors. But in the final analysis, the social and political effects of inequality are here to stay. They are an inherent feature of a democratic politics inserted into a capitalist economic system. That doesn't mean, though, that we can't fight to minimize those effects and create a playing field that, if not completely level, is more level for the average American citizen. Questions?
All right. I wanted to know, do you have any thoughts on universal basic income? Because that to me seems to, that would well,
yes,
I'll let you talk.
Well, this is another aspect of not so much dealing with the political effect of money, but dealing with inequality. I mean, you can deal with inequality either by bringing down the income and wealth of the rich, which is hard to do politically because they're politically powerful, right? Or by raising the economic level of the poor. One definition of poverty that I really like, because poverty is different in every country, that people are in poverty if they earn less than 1/2 of the median income. They have less than 1/2 of the median income. They can't live in the society in essentially similar ways to everybody else. You know, their kids have to have clothes with holes in them, and they can't have a phone, or, you know, there's 1/2 the median income. I think a guaranteed minimum income, which was proposed by Nixon and Milton Friedman back in the 70s, who knew, right? Makes a lot of sense. Another idea I like is giving every newly born baby a $50,000 savings bond or something that allows them to start life with assets that they can then use as they grow up for education, for buying a house, for starting a business. There have been some experiments with giving out basic income to people, both abroad and in a few places in the United States. and they have not had the terrifying impact on making people not work that they are thought to have. When the rich say, "Oh, we can't have welfare because then people won't work," well, look at all the welfare they're getting, and it doesn't seem to reduce their inclination to continue to invest and found businesses and so forth. So I think doing things to guarantee a basic standard of living for everybody would be tremendous. And along that, the first thing would be universal health care, which almost every other country has, including relatively poor countries like Greece or Uruguay. Right, right. And that should be resisted. Although the National Health Service in many ways is a mess, but then you should fix it, not get rid of it. Right, yeah.
Okay, next question, please, from Friendly House.
Yes, I was wondering whether there are other countries that are actually more unequal than the United States, and what lessons can be learned in terms of political instability and issues in those countries that might be used to convince our politicians that we need to have greater equality.
Well, my field of political science is comparative politics, and I'm especially a Latin American specialist. And inequality in Latin America, in all but Uruguay and Chile, is much higher than the United States and always has been, like the United States in part because of its history of radical inequality between European settlers and slaves, or European settlers and indigenous populations, which were used as the primary labor force. And so this has left a residue of indifference to investing in education for poor people who are seen not just as poor, but as other. You see this in the United States. Where is the lowest investment in education? Even today, and even worse 50 or 60 years ago, it's the South. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were periods in the late 19th century and the early 20th century where white voters in the South voted to stop spending any money on black schools, because why should we tax white people to educate black children? But something like that led to the fact that you look at educational attainment, and the worst places are in the South. You look at the quality of universities. This has changed somewhat in recent years. There's some high quality Southern universities now, but there didn't used to be any. You know, all the high quality universities were elsewhere. I'm actually a product of Southern universities. I went to Rice and graduated from the University of Texas. But yes, all the Latin American countries, Brazil's inequality is horrific. Mexico's inequality is horrific. Most developing countries who have somewhat developed are radically unequal, because development as it happens tends to be concentrated in urban areas. It tends to elevate a minority of the population closer to the standard of middle-class life in the developed world, while most of the country is not really developing at all. And so you get extreme differences of wealth and income in India, for example, where you've got a huge middle and professional class of a couple 100 million people, but you've got 1.2 billion people in the country, and you have large chunks of the population still living in miserable rural poverty. And that's what Brazil looks like too. One guy, this was 50 years ago or so, wanted to rename Brazil Bel India, because he said it was a Belgium on top of an India. So yeah, there are lots of countries that are more unequal than us, but they're all in the developing world. There's no developed country with a per capita income over $15,000 or $20,000 a year. We're tops. USA, we're number one. We've got the worst longevity, the worst life expectancy. We have the worst infant mortality.
Jeff, on the Zoom, we had a comment. Somebody said that, wait till medicine extends our lifespans even more, that's only going to go to the wealthy, and that will be another form of inequality.
Well, that's already happened. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just, I mean, and I think the danger in the future is another. I mean, we have things like genetic engineering that we probably are not going to regulate very well. And the rich are going to use that to genetically design their kids to be super people, and poor people are going to be left out of that. And in the United States, I mean, the two things that lead to this, one reason why the United States is so unequal, one is the weakness of labor unions. We were much more equal when labor unions were strong. And the other is simply racism. You know, white people in America think that all the people receiving government benefits are black people. It's not true. Most people receiving welfare benefits of various kinds are white people, poor white people, because there's so many more of us than black people. But that's sort of the image. And why should I pay money to raise the standard of living of those lazy other people? Societies that have more racial homogeneity, like Japan, like the Scandinavian countries, this is one reason they're more equal, is because they can see themselves in people who are struggling in their society. And then they tend to think of them as family members instead of threatening other people. And this is changing. Sweden now has a pretty significant population of Muslim immigrants, and the racism and discrimination being directed against them is substantial, and there are bills being proposed to exclude them from social benefits of one kind or another, and so forth.
All right. Jeff, are we kind of stuck in some aspects of our history? The Protestant ethic, of course, was that if you do well, it shows that God is favoring you. So that's a wonderful thing. And then also we admire wealthy people. I don't know if I can say that Republicans admire wealth more than Democrats do, but so how many people have the Trumps and other wealthy people on pedestals?
Such an intelligent question. You must have taken my class in political philosophy last winter. Yes, I mean, our history outside of slavery has been one of immigrants who came here to make their individual fortunes. Now, for some, that just meant getting a piece of land and having their own farm. But for others, it meant being entrepreneurs and the like. And so our cultural heroes, and we didn't have princes and dukes and barons and kings and emperors and stuff. So our cultural heroes have tended to be the super rich. Now, they've also tended to be seen as supervillains. And so we were simultaneously admiring people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and so forth, and demonizing him, you know, by such good Republicans as Theodore Roosevelt. But, you know, even some of them, Carnegie, who was just an outrageous employer, who was just hideously violent towards labor unions and the steel mills and all of that, nevertheless was a tremendous philanthropist. And he publicly expressed the philosophy that the wealth that he had was just was not, he didn't deserve that wealth. It was just a consequence of the rules of the game. And so it had come to him, and he saw it as a social trust to then use it in socially useful ways. And so Carnegie, among other things, built public libraries all over the country. There's still a public library that Carnegie built on the campus of Pacific University. It's not a library anymore. I can remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird that I got out of the public library in Fargo, North Dakota, and it was a Carnegie library. But he explicitly had the attitude that this wealth doesn't really belong to me. I'm just the custodian of this pile of money that happened to come to me because of the rules of the game of our society. And therefore, I have an obligation to share it. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, have been trying to get other entrepreneurs to get together and pledge to give away most of their wealth in socially beneficial ways. No, I think that's a problem too. I don't think the super rich should be the ones deciding who is deserving of assistance in the world. For a long time, Bill Gates had as a project, he wanted to put PCs in every kindergarten and every first grade. I personally don't think kindergartners in first grade should be on computers all day. I don't think that's something they should be exposed to until later in their schooling. So I thought that was actually a pernicious thing that he was trying to do with on the one hand, the best of intentions, and also looking at his bottom line, because then he was going to sell all these PCs to school systems.
Jules has a question online. My wife has told me Jules is one of our best questioners these days, and that he'll be right to the point and come up with a really dynamite question. Jules, go ahead.
And he didn't even take my class.
No, I didn't. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm a product of the CUNY system in New York City. Hunter, City, Brooklyn, and Queens colleges. Free education for those who qualify.
Right.
You have, in order to matriculate and get the benefits of a free education, your average, your point grade average, has to be, I think then it was 80. Anybody who had less than that did not qualify. Now, I sat there and I said, okay, I'm going to benefit because the people who structured that were the products of immigrants and knew that the only way out of the system was to get educated. Now, as an educator yourself, and your experience with the vast array of different abilities in students, are you excluding a group that has something to contribute, even though somehow they don't take tests well, they can't achieve those numbers that qualify them to get a good education?
Well, I think two things. I think we need to be flexible about what we see as qualifications, and GPAs and test scores can be wildly inaccurate to identify, especially the talents and abilities of people who've led pretty disadvantaged lives. And so I agree with the notion that people shouldn't go to college if they aren't able to benefit from the education. When I first started teaching at Pacific, they were desperate for students. They had lost about half of their student population. The four-year graduation rate was 24%. They were basically admitting anybody. And then they started stiffening their admissions requirements and recruiting a better student body. And I was there right at the transition point, and I could see the difference between the new students and the old students. But so I think admitting people according to qualifications is good, as long as we have a broad and flexible definition of what counts as a qualification. The other thing I think is, I think the CUNY system is outstanding. But for people who, after flexibilizing our qualifications, still can't go to CUNY, I think they still should have educational opportunities. I gave a lecture about the American higher education system to a Peruvian university years ago. My wife was Peruvian, and her sister was working there, and they were going through a reform period. And one of the things I emphasized to them that I thought was one of the great things about the American higher education system was our system of community colleges. And so many people who were working full time or had kids or who hadn't been good students but sort of got it together and wanted an education have gone through the community college system and either learned a skill. I have a sister-in-law who became a dental assistant through PCC. She was an immigrant from Peru as well. Or they use those 2 years to establish academic credentials and then go to a four-year institution and graduate. And we had quite a bit of those at Pacific as well. So I believe in qualifications for entry as long as those qualifications are not essentially class and race-based. But I also believe in creating forms of education so that everybody is able to get the sort of education that they're able to absorb and profit from.
Thank you.
Okay, next question from Friendly House.
This is a huge topic. So try and get my thoughts.
Where are you from?
Originally, I'm from England, London.
Okay.
But I've been in the US for over 20 years. Okay, so on the general topic of inequality, when we express equality as a broad goal, like what is our goal there? Do we want equality because it's justice, or is it like a utilitarian thing, which is like the greatest good for the greatest number? Because now we've got, you're talking about Bill Gates and the computers in schools. Now we've got these billionaires like Musk who describe themselves as effective altruists. And they've broadened the constituency of people who we have to consider to future generations. So now they would say things like, we shouldn't be spending money on all these people that are disadvantaged or whatever, because their brains have already been ruined. They've already like had inadequate childhood nutrition or whatever. We should be investing in the best.
They're lost cases.
Well, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think what they say is nonsense. But within the sort of the parameters of their philosophy, it's like we should be investing in people who can drive humanity forward. So when we talk about doctors, it's not that they deserve more money. We should be identifying the best people to be doctors, and not. I feel like in this country, sometimes being a doctor, for instance, is sort of considered as an award. It's like only that people who deserve the money, where in many countries, doctors aren't super well paid compared to other people.
Some places they're very poorly paid.
Yeah, and I mean, I know you mentioned something about, well, shouldn't they be compensated for all the schooling and all the rest of it? Well,
but they don't have to be multimillionaires.
Yeah, I mean, economic compensation is not the only thing. There's like honor, respect in society, and so on, and that tends to be ignored. We tend to discuss these things in purely economic terms, and there's things outside the economic sphere.
So your question is?
Oh gosh. So I guess I'm getting to the end of your talk, where you were saying about campaign finance reform and so on and so forth. Great ideas. My question is, how will we ever get them through a system where the multimillionaires are already in charge? They don't want that. They don't want things to become more equal. And I also sort of connected to that. You've mentioned a couple of times like societal stability and how it
we're running out of time here.
Sorry. Typically, revolution has been the corrective to like unstable populations, and I feel like some of the decline in the unions and the welfare state has coincided with the fall of the Soviet Union. Is it the threat of that having diminished in the Western world?
Can you just answer that, please, Jeff?
That's it.
Well, you just take the question of unions. The decline of unions, especially in the private sector, has been devastating in terms of the impact on inequality. I am heartened by the fact that in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a sort of resurgence of the union movement. These victories that were won by the writers' union and by the UAW in the auto industry are very encouraging, and there should be more of them. And I was encouraged by the fact that both the president and the public at large were very supportive of the UAW workers. And they emphasized inequality. They said, hey, the CEO of Ford is making $29 million a year, and we're making peanuts. How is that fair? And the CEO is making 60% more than they made 15 years ago, and we're making 4% more than we made 15 years ago. That resonated tremendously in the population as a whole. And so I think those are politically potent issues that can lead to legislation and I always have felt the most important first reforms are not reducing inequality, but reforming the political system so that it would be easier to make reform to address inequality. And so But most societies have managed that. I don't think that America today has become simply a plutocracy. It is still possible for ordinary people to have political victories. We got Obamacare, imperfect as it is. It's a big improvement of what was there before. We got Medicare, we got Medicaid, we got civil rights laws. We got the other big pieces of legislation that the Democrats have passed in the recent Congresses, despite their very slim majorities. So political change isn't impossible, but it is certainly difficult. There's an author who came out with a book a couple of years ago, very pessimistic book on equality. He says the only times that there have been major shifts towards greater equality have been through catastrophic wars, plagues, and violently divisive revolutions. That's it. And none of those had particularly desirable overall outcomes. But he said there just aren't any examples of radical shifts towards equality through normal, peaceful political processes in democracies or autocracies or anywhere. Now, I happen to be a fan of Uruguay because Uruguay had a progressive government for 15 years that greatly reduced inequality in the country and did something I don't know that's happened in any other country, reduced inequality between rural areas and the cities by promoting the creation of rural trade unions and also the creation of domestic workers' trade unions. And so the number of people in unions like quadrupled during those 15 years, and inequality was reduced. No, the CIA didn't stop it. It wasn't a revolutionary government. It didn't create deeply divisive politics. It lost the last election, so there's now a conservative government in Uruguay, but it doesn't have the courage to undo any of the reforms that were done because the progressive political coalition is still strong and could easily win the next election. And so things are possible. Sweden was a capitalist society and a pretty reactionary capitalist society in 1900. In the 1930s, the Social Democrats came to power, and they stayed in power for 50 years, and they created the welfare system in Sweden that is so extensive everywhere, and it's in decline now. But it was there for a long time, and even in decline, it's vastly superior to the welfare system of Britain and certainly of the United States. So reform is possible, but it's hard work. And but the first thing that needs to be done is to address the mechanisms that allow rich people to convert their wealth into political power. And until you do something serious in that, then all these other things are very hard to do because the rich will block them. Can I make one brief personal announcement before you do that?
Sure, please do.
On a personal note, some of you may remember a lecture I gave back in the spring of 2016 before Trump was elected, but when he and Ben Carson were leading the Republican race in the polls. The title of my lecture back then was "The Making of an Un-American: Why I Want to Move to Uruguay, but My Wife Won't Let Me." I don't know if you remember this. Well, about 3 years ago, after 4 years of Trump, I had pretty well persuaded my wife, Maria, that we should move to Uruguay. And we were on the verge of doing that. But just then, she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and we had to set those plans aside. This past week, after 3 years of struggling with her cancer, it finally caught up to her. And she passed away on Thursday.
Ouch.
I decided to go ahead and come do this lecture today because I think of you humanists as good friends of mine. We go back about 15 years, and I thought this would be good therapy. And I was right. It was. It's good to be among friends. right now. And yes, I am once again seriously considering moving to Uruguay, although it could never be the same without Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Oh, my.
Thank you.